I'm Kaitlyn McConnell, and I'm here with Robert Stevens as part of the Trucking on Route 66 project, a collaboration between MSU Libraries and Ozarks Alive. Robert is going to share some of the memories he heard from his father's days trucking, and thank you very much again for being willing to participate in this project.
Happy to be here.
Well, first off, kind of just give some of the background, kind of what was your dad's role, how did he get involved, what company did he work for, things like that.
My dad was pretty much a handyman, growing up. He did a lot of different things, but primarily driving was one of them. He also did some tile setting and, laboring type work and so forth. But I remember the part we're going to talk about, is the part I remember where he was driving, where there was some labor unrest in the area and so forth. And, that's mainly what I remember, that he was gone a lot, and then there were times where he was home and he was working on these little projects and so forth, and it just made an impression on me.
Did you guys live here in Springfield? Or?
We did.
Okay. Do you even know, did he talk about what sorts of things he was hauling most of the time, or how he even got into it?
It ranged, depending on the size of the truck he was driving. It might be, groceries, it might be cattle, depending on the truck, just a variety of things.
What approximately time period probably would have this been?
It was probably in that 62 to 65, 1965 time frame. I remember being junior high, maybe barely into high school, maybe out of elementary school, but somewhere around my junior high years.
Did he ever even talk about like what routes he was going? Where I guess that depended on what he was driving, what type.
Yeah, but primarily he did a lot going up north, up into Iowa and so forth and back. I don't recall hearing him say anything about going over to Illinois, Indiana. And one of my school friends' dad was also a truck driver, and he was always talking about Terre Haute, Indiana, and a city over in Oklahoma where his dad would go frequently and so forth.
Did it seem like he enjoyed it, or did he just kind of, was it just a job?
I think it was more just a job. He had driven a bus for Continental Trailways, which were, at the time there were two bus lines, Continental Trailways and Greyhound, and I believe Trailways has pretty much gone out of business or been absorbed or something. But I think he really preferred that, but times weren't the best at that time, and he wound up driving a truck and so forth.
What was this may tie to what the other topic you were going to mention too, but what was the reasoning he got out of the business? He was only in that for a couple of years.
I think it was really some of the labor unrest and some of the potential danger and so forth. One of the things that I do remember very clearly, we had a little shop out in the backyard, and I went out there one time, and he had the handle of like hedge clippers, cut off. And he was drilling a hole down one end of it, and then another hole in about 5 or 6 inches down, and was pouring melted lead down into that. And when it was finished, basically he had a club about 18 inches long that was weighted with lead in one end and had a leather strap to go around your wrist on the other end. And he made the comment, just in case. And, so there was, anybody that was driving was aware there was going to be some potential violence out there and so forth.
What are some of the details that you remember about why that was and kind of how it started?
Honestly, I don't remember anything about what caused it. I do know now, from history and so forth, there were some scandals about the Teamsters pension program. Jimmy Hoffa disappeared and is yet to be found, from what I understand, and so forth. So I think there was some labor unrest all over the country, and and it's kind of understandable, if you're a member of a union and all of a sudden $18 million of your pension fund has disappeared, it's upsetting.
I wonder, him making that club obviously he was worried about violence, but in my mind I think, well, did he think somebody was going to come up to him at a truck stop and try to pick a fight? Were they the things like the road issues like you were going to talk about that was more of the problem? I just wonder what was going through his mind to think, when might I need this?
I think it was just to have some kind of defensive weapon with him. Wow. He was not a gun guy, so this was the next best thing.
Wow. Well, do you want to show those again?
Yeah, and this really comes from more my own experience. There was a company across the street from where I worked back in the late 70s that had a strike going on, and they had some of their folks, well, allegedly, some of their folks would take a nail, nail about so long, cut the head off, bend it, and each end would be sharpened, and then they would take another one the same way and weld them together so that whenever you threw them out on the driveway, there would always be a sharp point sticking up, and it created a lot of mischief with tires and so forth, and things of that nature. And I used to have one on my desk that I picked up. I saw it out in the road as I was getting ready to turn in out of the driveway, and just stopped and picked it up and kept it around for a while and so forth. But I can see that maybe 3 guys in a garage had a little assembly line going. One would cut the end off, one would grind it and bend it, the other would spot weld it, and here they went and stuff. And you see this fairly frequently in places that are having labor unrest or contract issues and things of that nature.
Around that time period, did we hear about any major issues like trucks driving across those and accidents happening, things like that you recall?
When I was in college, I worked part-time for the U.S. Postal Service, and I worked out at Glenstone Station out on Glen Isle, and there was something going on at the time. I wasn't, being a college kid, I wasn't paying any attention to it, but there was a company over in the west part of the state that hauled dynamite, and they were having some labor issues. And apparently there was a driver who was on one side and was firing a rifle at a guy driving the truck for the company. Supposedly was aiming at the engine to disable it, but missed the cab, hit the contents, and it exploded and blew a hole in the entire 2 lanes of I-44 down by Halltown. And you can find the news stories and so forth about that. And obviously the driver of the truck was killed and so forth. So, you had that kind of thing going on. And even here a while back, I hadn't retired yet. I was still working company over on 65 Bypass. And one of the companies over there was having some labor trouble, and they tipped an 18-wheeler over right in front of our plant and so forth. So, it occurs, and there are things that go on that aren't necessarily civilized, I guess.
How do you pick an 18-wheeler back up that's fallen over? Do you remember what they had
I don't know, thankfully. I wasn't wasn't watching, but kind of got run over into the ditch.
Wow.
And I guess you just get a wrecker and somehow pop it back up. But I would imagine the traffic would be interrupted for a little bit. Yeah.
In the time period your dad was trucking, was there a social element to it at all? Did he? I mean, I think you mentioned somebody you went to school with. Dad was a truck driver too, but were there other people that he knew that were truck drivers that they kind of were friends, or was it kind of just what he did for that period of time, and then he got out and kind of moved on from that?
I think it's probably after he left the bus company, driving the bus, he was looking for something to do, and just sort of fell into this. But I don't think he was ever comfortable doing it, or in the particular environment or the time that he wound up driving a truck and so forth, and so got out of it, and then became a tile setter, and worked in construction quite a bit, I think, for the rest of his life.
And one thing that hit me after you said that you grew up here in Springfield, I'm guessing you were a kid more in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you.
Yeah. we figured, like I said, the Route 66 connection is pretty big in our research, but
Right.
I haven't had anyone really talk about what they remember about the Route 66 days of Springfield back during that period. What do you remember about downtown and that whole, would have been along Route 66 back then here?
I don't think that those of us who were here growing up at that time were really conscious of how large a role Route 66 played.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much like people in Springfield don't realize how broad the O'Reilly Automotive footprint is in the country, or how broad the footprint of Bass Pro Shops is in the country, or even around the world. One time I was picking up an engineer that was visiting our country, and he was from Israel, and the first thing off the plane that he said, "I want to see Bass Pro." And we're going, how do you even know about Bass Pro in Israel? But, we're here, we grew up with it,
Mm-hmm.
and it just doesn't really dawn on us how widespread that influence is.
Mm-hmm.
And so back when I was 10, 11, 12, riding my bike around delivering papers and so forth, I was aware of Route 60. I was aware of Campbell 66, the trucking company, and their motto. But as far as Route 66 itself, until and I didn't even recognize it then. There was a television program called Route 66. A couple of guys just running out, and they had all these things happen to them and so forth. But even then, I didn't realize why Route 66 was the name of the show, or that it played such an important part in the distribution of goods and so forth, and people, all along. I mean, that's part of my dad's generation grew up riding the bus somewhere. If they went on vacation, they thought nothing of getting on a bus and going somewhere. It was the generation that they had, my generation, that for the first time was going on vacations in your own car, and so forth, or station wagon, as the case may be. And that's where the roads became very important, and that's when President Eisenhower proposed the interstate transportation system and so forth.
And I guess the configuration may have changed even before the time you would remember the most, but I'm trying to picture, around the square, because people going from Chicago to LA would have just all had to circle through there, and it's hard to picture how crazy busy those areas must have been back when that was the main way.
It was, and it was busy, and they had parking on the square when I was a kid, and you had 4 little quadrants, and you might go around 5 times waiting for somebody to back out so you could get into that spot, very much like it is today, and so forth. But Springfield downtown, there was no Battlefield Mall. I mean, downtown was where you went, and I remember buying a lot of clothes for high school and college at Heer's, and National Shirt Shop was down there. And then you had your 3 dime stores, Woolworths, Krusty's, and Newberry's were down there. And it was just, you see people strolling up and down Battlefield Mall inside now. It was like that, but it was all downtown at the time. And then the holidays, the whole area was decorated and stuff. So,
this is just a random question. I don't know if the younger version of yourself would have thought about this at the time, but
probably not.
Were we, being Springfield, really trying to grab tourist-wise any of those like the people driving through from Chicago to LA as they came through town, or did we even think about that so much?
I don't think we thought about that. There were probably a few people that did, and you see things still around like the Railhaven Motel and some of the little hotels that were out West College, because that's where Route 66 went. I think they maybe got into it, to make some money, but weren't really cognizant. And I don't think we really got into the tourist thing until much later and so forth. And it's really been the last 5 to 8 years that we've really been pushing the birthplace of Route 66, and that's kind of our claim to fame. And you have the shows every year, the weekend, and 40,000 people show up. And I remember I was on city council at the time we had our first thing. It was raining and there weren't very many people around. We were huddled under these little tents and so forth. But there was one couple from Japan that was coming through town. They had flown over to California and were retracing Route 66 from the west. And that same day we had a couple from Belgium who had flown into New York and were tracing Route 66 going the other way. And, you know, what are the odds of both those couples hitting Springfield when we have our birthplace of Route 66 festival starting? And it was just, you know, one of those magical moments that happened, and they were pretty interesting.
Like the big definition of perfect timing.
Really, very definitely.
You mentioned Campbell 66, and just from, you know, as a bystander in Springfield, you know, what kind of was your perception of them as, you know, what did people think about them, or did they even think about them at the time? I mean, I know they were a huge operation.
I think people then thought about them in the way we think about O'Reilly and Bass Pro now. They were the dominant business. We never thought about them necessarily being the dominant business in a particular industry, or at least I didn't. Of course, you know, I was 12, 13 at the time we're talking about. But, you know, it was the Campbell 66 logo was just always there. You know, it's very much like Prime now. It's hard to go anywhere in Springfield without seeing a Prime truck heading down Glenstone or up I-44 or something like that. And that's the way it was with the Campbell 66 trucks.
I wonder if a lot of guys in Springfield worked for them, or if they, you know, had people stationed everywhere that worked for them.
I don't know. You know, you'll have to find a Route 66 or Campbell 66 person for that one.
Oh yeah, and I look at my mind just wanders as we talk. But you know, and the other thing, and I don't know if this would have ever. This is probably too early for you too, but you know, one person talked about how much of the competition there was between the railroad and trucking, even as years progressed, because with the railroad having been such a big deal, they felt really threatened by this.
Well, yeah, that's very definitely with the railroad coming, especially Frisco Railroad coming to Springfield. That pretty much built all of North Springfield, you know, north of Commercial. And you could still go up and down streets over there on the other side of Commercial Street and see houses that have the little, where it has their house number, like 1243 or whatever, but it's cut in the shape of the Frisco logo. And a lot of those houses were built by the railroad for their employees who were coming here and so forth. So, yeah, that was a time of change because, you know, all of a sudden, truck traffic gave you the option to get off the rail line. You either had to go to the rail line and get what you needed, or had to hire somebody to go to the rail line and bring it to you. Well, now, you know, trucks were coming around and could actually bring it directly to your location, whatever you were looking for. So, yeah, it was, you know, kind of a sea change that was happening then, and I don't think any of us that were involved in it, you know, thought about it much. We were aware of the people that were in the industry, especially the railroad industry, were probably more aware of it. But it's very similar to some of the political changes you see going on in our country right now. And, you know, we may be a little restless and a little fussy about things, but, you know, we'll get through this too.
When you were growing up, did it feel like the railroad was still a really big deal here?
It was. My baseball coach worked for the railroad. And so there were times where we had to cancel practice because he'd get called out of town on a railroad thing and so forth. So that was a big deal. You know, I mean, there were a lot of people in my life who worked for the railroad. Guy across the street, parents of what we called the Main Street kids, you know, I believe worked for the railroad for a while and stuff. And, you know, yeah, it was a job to covet.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the best paying jobs, and a lot of people wanted to go to work there.
Your dad never was connected with them at all, though, was he?
No.
Okay. I'm trying to think what else. Are there any other stories? You meant, I mean, that club one is not great. It's a great story, but were there any other things that kind of just stick out in your mind from back when he was driving?
That was a period of time when I think we as a family probably had more money than any other time, you know, that I was growing up. And, you know, obviously, I mean, you're gone a lot, you're driving long hours, long miles, and so forth, and, you know, hopefully the pay was, you know, worth the risk, if there was a risk, and there were risks at different times, you know, and, yeah, so that's basically what I remember from that.
Was it where he was on routes where he'd be gone for basically a week and then come back, or was it more, you know, 2 or 3 days?
It seemed like it was more like 3 to 5 days, and not necessarily Monday to Friday. It might be Thursday to Tuesday or something like that. But, you know, I mean, stuff has to get moved no matter what day it is. And, you know, they move it and they just get scheduled. And I think it was probably pretty much by seniority, which means since he had come from the bus company to trucking, he was pretty low on the seniority list, so he probably got all the grunt shifts and stuff.
Well, that just leads me to a whole other question, because I get the, you know, going from driving a bus to driving a truck, that would seem like it wasn't a huge change, but where do you learn how to drive a bus? Back then, was there a bus school?
I have no idea. I mean, he was driving a bus when I first got old enough to know that Dad went somewhere, you know, and that he did something, and you know, that's when. And there were times where Mom would take me down to the bus station, and I'd get on the bus, and we'd go all the way out of town to Seven Gables. Now, Seven Gables is nowhere near out of town anymore. It's just a few blocks on the other side of the West Bypass, but that was way out of town, and my mom would drive out there and pick me up, and that was just so cool to get to, you know, sit there in that front seat and watch my dad drive the bus, and you know, then get off and get in Mom's car and we'd go back home. Sometimes we'd get to stop at Red's for a hamburger.
You know, yes, I missed out on that. I feel very disappointed. Everyone has.
You are certainly deprived.
Wow. Well, I guess the last thing I'd ask then is you know, with the Route 66 connection, are there any landmarks today still in Springfield that seem on Route 66 that seem similar to when you were growing up here, kind of during its heyday? You know, Red's obviously is gone. The Railhaven's still here. Are there any other things that are still here that people could look at that in your mind you'd think, oh yeah, that's kind of the same as it used to be?
From most of them have been repurposed over the years. You know, obviously hers was the linchpin of the square, and Route 66 ran right through the square, and you know, it's now apartments and loft apartments and so forth. I mean, if you look around the square, there isn't a building now that is being used for what it was used for when I was growing up in the 50s. But all of the buildings are still there, and they're all in use. And that just, you know, I think a microcosm of what we're talking about, the transition from rail transportation to truck transportation, and you know, the transition from the 50s to the 60s, and you know, anytime you get in a period of change, there's unrest, and I think that's, you know, what you see happening.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.